Hello! So you may have seen the most recent release from Oden's Eye, the Perfect World collection, which includes a collaboration with my favorite influencer, LaurenMaeBeauty, as well as the influencers MakeupJustForFun and Battybean, who both also are awesome. But some of you may know that I have some pretty big expenses coming up in the future, including some international travel and my wedding in a couple of months. So I just don't have the budget to buy the collection. So what I've done instead is I've duped out all three palettes. It's my way of showing some love, appreciating the work and beautiful color stories that these influencers put together, but also saving myself some money in the process. So if you want to appreciate the beautiful color stories that they've put together and see my takes on those, then go ahead and just keep on watching and subscribe. Let's go ahead and swatch all three palettes first, and then I'll give some thoughts that I have on the collection at the end. But first up is LaurenMaeBeauty's palette, Sea Talk. She said in her video that they asked her to do a blue palette, and I appreciate that though she did a blue palette, she didn't make it an exclusively blue palette. When I look at this collection of colors, it does feel very LaurenMaeBeauty-esque, both with like her love of color from years past and her more recent love of like minky neutrals. So I love that I can see her inspiration in this color story. Let me go ahead and tell you now what I've picked out. So the first shade is the one that she named Dolphin Tail, I think it is, and I chose the ColourPop shade Take the Lead. It was hard to tell the colors. I used her video obviously as reference, but then I also used MakeupJustForFun's video as well as Angelica Nyquist's video and the Oden's Eye website, and I feel like the three videos were more similar, but I don't know, it was hard to tell, and so I went with something that's a nice cool brown. I decided to go for something that was a little less gray than some of the other colors I was considering, but I feel like I don't know 100% if these colors that I've picked are going to be accurate to the actual palette, but I've tried my best. So this is that first shade, just a cool brown matte. Next, for that kind of bronzy shade that she has, I chose the Looksy shade, the Monarch, which I thought was a good choice because I know that this is a color that she has really enjoyed in the past, and so it felt fitting to have it in a dupe of her palette, and I thought it matched pretty well. This one, again, I couldn't tell if it was more rosy or more golden based on the different swatch videos, but I like that the Monarch has a little bit of both. It has a little bit of golden sparkle, but there's definitely something pink in it too. Next up is the Acidic Green that she chose, and I love the idea of it being a satin. I have a bunch of these colors in matte and shimmer formulas, but no satins, so I just went with a more shimmery version of this, since I know in true Lauren fashion it would be an inner corner color for me. And this one is Depotted from the Profusion Neon palette. Next is the warmer blue with a golden shift that she has. I know that the one that she has in the palette is definitely a lot more sparkly, which totally makes sense for her style. I didn't have anything super sparkly. Some of you may know I'm not a big blue person, which is another reason I don't think that I would have bought this palette, but I did enjoy the challenge of putting some blues together, and what I had for this color was the Glaminatrix shade Bunny, and even though it's not quite as sparkly, I do feel like the color itself does seem pretty accurate to what I saw. Next, for that darker shade that she has, that's the Duochrome with a purple and blue, I actually decided to go with the Cleona shade Lapis Lazuli. I know that this one does go like kind of pink and gold as well, but since the other two palettes had multi-chromes, I liked the idea of adding a multi-chrome to Lauren's palette, and I didn't want anything too dark because I know I just won't use it as often, whereas this one I felt like it still has a darker base, but since it is an iridescent multi-chrome, like a deep iridescent multi-chrome, I figured it was a little bit more approachable for me personally. This shade is Depotted from the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural or Nearly Neutral palette. I thought it was fitting to put this color in here because I know that this is a palette that Lauren has really enjoyed. I think that the color that she has in her Oden's Eye palette seems a little bit more PC sparkly, but again, going with what I had, I was pretty happy with this color dupe. This was one I went back and forth on because it seems like in some people's videos it looks more silver in the base, in some people's video it looks more purple, and then in others it looks more of like a taupey brown. So I just decided to go with this one, but I think that it could be a little different from what is actually in the palette. For the deep reddish brown, I have a Depotted shade from a Moira palette, which again felt very fitting for a LaurenMaeBeauty dupe because I know that she's been really enjoying a lot of Moira products, although mostly the blushes, but still, you know, we'll throw in an eyeshadow and say it's fitting. I could have used 100 different shades for this, but that's the one I chose. For the pink shade, I couldn't tell quite how deep the pink base was on it, but in Lauren's video, it seemed like a pretty light pink, so that's what I decided to do for my dupe. I chose the Terra Moon shade Celestial Petal, and it does have that really strong blue sparkle. In some people's videos, I felt like it looked a little more silver, so I thought that this was a good compromise shade, although it probably could be a little bit pinker. Still though, I'm really happy with this one, and I think that when in her video she talked about using it on the brow bone and inner corner, and I could totally use this light pink shade in that way. Next up, I decided to go with another Looksy shade. This is the shade Electric Lemonade, and I chose it because in my recent Looksy swatch party video, I realized this one has a purpley pink shift that I've really never noticed in it before. And so since the one that Lauren has in her palette has that kind of purple shift to it, just like the darker one, I thought it would be a good complement. And she talked about using this one as a topper, and given how light the base is on it, I really thought that that would be a good topper shade and could add a little bit more sparkle if I wanted to pair these two blues together. So that's why I chose this one. And then the last to round it out is a deep blue. I couldn't tell if it was a warmer blue or a cooler blue, so I decided to go, oh my god, let me wipe that off. I decided to go with something a little bit warmer though, just because I thought it tied well with those warmer browns, and even the cooler like gray brown I thought could go well with it. This is Depotted from the ABH Subculture palette. All right, here is my version of LaurenMaeBeauty's palette, all swatched out. And I have to say, when I was watching the video, I was disheartened by the number of blues that she had, which I know totally makes sense. She does enjoy blue eyeshadow. But I have to say, once I started building it out, I actually was kind of enjoying the blues that were in here. And I feel like nothing is too daunting of like a bright, bright blue that I wouldn't try to use it on the eyes. So I really enjoy it. I totally see her inspiration, and I'm glad to have my version of it. Now let's move on to Makeup Just for Fun's palette. Makeup Just for Fun did this more green and purple color story called Flora Story, and I have to be honest, out of the three palettes, this one is my favorite, and it also was the hardest for me to dupe. I feel like I'm not quite there on some of the shades, but I also felt like this one had the largest discrepancy in some of the swatches, especially these greens, depending on where you looked. So that made it a little bit challenging. I'll go ahead and start swatching. This first shade is an iridescent multi-chrome that goes from an orange to a green. and this is the shade Zira from Divina, which I think is going to be a pretty spot-on dupe for the shade in the palette. And I feel like you can see that green starting to peek through on the edge a little bit there. The next shade is Depotted from a ColourPop palette, though I couldn't tell you which one. I actually have a few ColourPop shades in here that are depotted, and again, I thought it was totally fitting for Makeup Just for Fun because she does so much ColourPop content. I will say I really love her Instagram and how she compares new ColourPop releases to old things. I think she has one of the most helpful channels for makeup consumers. Next is the purple shimmer that she had in her palette, and I think it is a beautiful shade, but I don't have anything quite like it, and so I decided to go with Opulent from Clionadh because it does have that purple base, and I wanted to make sure that I was choosing something that was different enough from this shade in LaurenMaeBeauty's palette, and this one has a little bit more of a gold and green shift to it, which I thought was a fun addition given that it's kind of a purple and green color story. So here it is. This next shade is my attempt at the deeper olive green in the palette, and in a lot of the swatches it didn't look super warm, and so I wanted to stay away from something that was too yellow based, and this is what I ended up choosing. It is a matte shade Depotted from the Surge palette from Blend Bunny Cosmetics. This shade is definitely different from the one that is in the Makeup Just for Fun palette, but I decided to go this route for a few different reasons. I guess I should say this is the shade Biennium from Copacetic Cosmetics. So the first reason I went with this shade over a really like deep punchy green shade is because I think I'll use this more for myself personally. The second reason is that LaurenMaeBeauty mentioned this having a warmer green base and then like a blue sparkle on top, which is really what this shade has. But the third reason I picked this is that it's a multi-chrome that also shifts to a purple, which again, given the purple and green color story, I thought that was like a perfect fit for this palette, and so that's the one I ended up going with, even though I know it's probably not the best dupe I have for this color in my collection. And again, trying to show those multi-chromes, I actually took my mirror to work and forgot it there, so much for the mirror, but you can kind of see that purple peeking through at the end. I'll try to grab a palette mirror to show off these multi-chromes a little bit more here at the end. Next is the lighter green shade, and I went with Kelp from Menagerie, although I will say out of all of the shades in this palette, this is the one I took the longest to decide on, because in some pictures it looks way more like, I don't know, like sagey green, but in others it has that really yellow acidic green going on, and I was struggling. So I might end up switching this out, you know, as I use this palette if I feel like something else works better for me, but I thought that vibe-wise, this was my best choice for the palette based on everything I saw. This is a very light green, kind of goldish shade from a ColourPop palette. It was the one with like plants on the front that had just come out. It was like their first release after the pandemic. I used to really enjoy it. I know a lot of people didn't, but when I saw the green, I was like, oh, that feels pretty close to this, I think. So that's the one I chose. But again, this one was hard. That's all I'll say. Now for the lighter purpley pink matte, we've got October Odyssey Light from Sydney Grace, which is actually from another collab with Temptalia. And I thought this one was pretty close. And for all of you who might have been cringing at my swatch, I did go ahead and fix it up a little bit. I'm there with you. This next shade is one that I think is maybe pretty different in the actual palette. I chose something Depotted from the Pat McGrath Bridgerton 2 palette, and I was looking for something that's a little bit more of a blue-green and something that was a little bit deeper, but I feel like it probably isn't right. If I was going to buy a palette, this is definitely the one I'd get, since it kind of proved to me in my attempt to dupe it that I don't really have some of these shades, I think, unless, again, it could be different in real life than it appears in the stuff online. Then the last color, one more color pop. This is from one of the purple palettes. I can't remember which one. It's one of the monochromatic 9 pans. And I thought this one was pretty spot on. And I love that she included this color because this is one of my favorite type of deepening shades. Really, this color story is so wonderful to me. I really enjoy it. And I'm really excited to use the one that I have, because even though I don't think it's the same as the Oden's Eye one, I do think that it's the same type of vibe, and I'm really excited to use it. Please disregard how dirty this palette mirror is, but I feel like you can see some of those shifts a little bit better in those multi-chromes. Although I feel like the other mirror that I used in my last video was probably better. Last up, we have Battybean's Planet Spirit palette, which is definitely the most punchy out of the bunch. And interestingly, I thought it was the easiest for me to dupe. I don't think that all of the shades are spot on, but I was pretty happy with how this turned out. And I thought it was interesting because I feel like these are the colors that I gravitate towards wearing a lot more than the bright punchy colors like this. Although I can totally see how Battybean came up with this. I've been really enjoying her series where she does a build your own palette each month. I love seeing creators do that, and so I'm totally happy that all 3 of these creators got their opportunity to collab. Let's go ahead and get into swatching though. First up is a shade from the Treasure pop-up palette from Shine by SD. This is the shade Sparkle and Shine, I want to say it is. Yes, Sparkle and Shine. And it is a kind of multi-chrome that goes from a green to a pink in the shift. So it seemed pretty similar to how at least LaurenMaeBeauty described the shade that Battybean did. Next, I have just a kind of seafoamy green blue kind of shade. This, I think, maybe a little bit darker than the one that's in the actual palette, but I was torn between this shade, which is Depotted from the Beauty Bay Age of Opulence palette, or the Terra Moon's single Just a Phase, which is way more green, but also more neon. I decided to go with this though, because I thought it matched the shimmer shade better, which we'll get to later on. This is the other shade that I feel like I struggled with the most. It seemed really warm in the base, but it also seemed golden on top. I didn't have anything quite like that, so I decided to go with this shade from the It's Belle Break the Rules palette. It's a little bit punchy, corally orange, red kind of vibe in the base, which I thought was right. But this one has a green shimmer that shifts pink, which I don't think is 100%. This shade is Xenia from Looksy, and I thought that this was gonna be perfect based on all the swatches I saw. I mean, this is a shade that is so fun, but I do feel like a lot of different brands have a shade like this, so you might have something similar already in your collection. Now we've got the Terra Moon's shade Lightspeed, and I think that this might be a little more true yellow than the shade that Battybean came up with, but I thought it kind of stuck with the really bright, poppy, colorful vibe. So I decided to stick with it, even though I was kind of considering the shade Until Dawn from Looksy too. This hot pink, or neon pink, I think is a little lighter and maybe less warm than the shade that is in the Planet Spirit palette. But I thought the shade that I had that I was considering using instead of this, I thought was too close to the last shade, so I went with this one instead. And this is Depotted from that same Blend Bunny Surge palette. Actually, this next shade is also from the Blend Bunny Surge palette, and it's just a blue metallic kind of shade that I thought was pretty spot on from what I saw. And I love that metallic formula that was in this shade, especially in that palette from Blend Bunny. I believe that this shade I depotted from the Cake palette from Glamlight, but I could be wrong. It's my most like neutral orange, but also bright orange matte shade I have that doesn't lean too yellow or too red, so it by default got put in here. This shade is from JD Glow. It's a metallic called Lavender, and originally I had put a Sydney Grace shade called Lavender Hills, I think it's called, here instead of the shade Opulent. But I thought it was too similar to this one, so I ended up switching it out and keeping the Lavender JD Glow shade in here because I thought it matched pretty well with the swatches I saw. And then last but not least, we have the Looksy shade Bleeding Heart, which again, I thought was pretty spot on in that it balanced like pink and red well and seemed like the same level of depth. So here is my dupe of the Planet Spirit palette by Battybean, all swatched out. Let me go wash off my arm and then we'll talk about all three palettes. I hope that you enjoyed the swatches. If that's all that you were here for, feel free to X out now. I'm gonna go ahead and give some of my thoughts that I had initially to the launch, starting with the fact that I noticed like it felt like some shades between the palettes were pretty similar. For example, these two shades, which again, obviously aren't the ones that are in the palettes, right? But these two shades from Lauren's palette and Makeup Just for Fun's palette seemed kind of similar in some of the swatches that I saw, as well as like this blue shade and this green shade seemed like they had something more in common in the original versions of the palette. Some of the mattes too, I felt like were kind of similar, like this blue and this blue. But again, I think this one's maybe punchier in the actual palette. And it seems like the girls all were in communication as they were building their palettes from at least the way that their videos were presented. So I was kind of surprised with some of them being what seemed like pretty close. One thing that I did love is that I really feel like I could feel each of the creators in the palettes that they made. Like this seems very Lauren-esque, this seems very Makeup Just for Fun-esque, and that is definitely very Battybean type of colors and stuff. I would say out of the three, I feel like these two have more unique color stories, whereas this one, it kind of reminds me of like the one that Tina from the Fancy Face did with her Oden's Eye collab. And something else I noticed is that some of the shades in their palettes felt very similar to some of the new singles that Oden's Eye came out with. I'm not sure if any of you felt that way, but for example, like the green and some of like these more neutral colors and the blues and everything, it just felt similar to some of the shimmers that they released. And I heard that like from consumers, they didn't really love those shadows. So I'm kind of glad that I skipped out on them, and I'm really hoping that it's not the same formula that is in these palettes, because I've heard that the palette formulas are pretty good in the past, and I enjoy the original Alva palette that I have. I guess my last overall thought is that I wish that they had kept the same formatting that they used for the legendary Diversa collection, because I feel kind of bad for all of the people who have gotten all of those palettes so far, that these ones aren't going to line up well with the others, which I think is a shame. And I think that given how close the theming is to the legendary Diversa collection, I think that they could have used the same like structure and just considered this like a part 3 of the collection if you consider Angelica's part 2. And I think that people maybe would have appreciated that more, but maybe I'm wrong. If you have those palettes, let us know your thoughts down below. I don't have any of them, so this is all just kind of my opinions. To wrap up though, I really did enjoy getting to dupe out these palettes and try my best to figure out these color stories. I enjoy all three of these creators, and even though I'm not paying for the palettes to support them, I am trying my best to support them by using the color stories and the visions that they came up with, commenting on their videos, liking, following their social media accounts, all of those types of things. And if you're struggling with the idea of like, these are some of your favorite influencers and you want to buy to support, but you maybe aren't in love with the color story, or you don't have the funds, or whatever it may be, just know there are plenty of ways that we are supporting these influencers, and they wouldn't be getting the opportunities to even collab with brands like Oden's Eye if it weren't for the fact that we were engaging with their content to begin with. So keep that in mind if you are like me and we're struggling with the idea of not getting one of the palettes for whatever reason. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Until I see you next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy. Bye!